Okay, Dave Cortman. Hey, I'm excited to have you here on our leadership podcast. We have talked an awful lot on our podcast, and it's been kind of one of the neat themes that have taken place. That our kind of journey is never a straight line. We work, I work with teenagers for a living, and it's so intriguing because they want to know, what does step number 17 look like? and we're constantly trying to tell them, like, hey, don't sweat step number 17. Just be faithful in the next step.
Yeah, worry about step number 1.
Just worry about getting started,
That's right.
And so here you are, you're an attorney making an enormous impact on our nation, particularly right now. Your work, your research is right at the epicenter of what's taking place, even with our Supreme Court right now, with some rulings that distinctly inform how faith, and certainly from my perspective, how Christian education with this most recent Supreme Court case, how that will play out in our nation in the years and decades to come. But I also love the fact that this certainly was not what you intended to do when you were a younger guy. And so tell us a little bit about kind of how life started for you and the various twists and turns in your journey that led you to this spot.
Yeah, so it definitely not a straight line, but God knows what he's doing. We just don't get to see it until later on in life. But, looking back, I was brought up in a Christian home, and that was important to us, and so I had that good foundation. But when it came to college and career, we never had those discussions. Mm-hmm. We didn't talk about them. You just kind of thought, well, what do I like to do? And my generation was the first to go to college in my family. So my siblings and I were the first ones to go to college. My parents didn't. Their grandparents didn't. So that was kind of a new thing in our family. And So when I was younger, I figured, what did I want to do? Well, I like numbers. I like neatness. They tease like I'm like Jerry Seinfeld. I'm like very neat. So I like the fact of numbers. I like the columns. I like the counting. That just was orderly and neat for me. So I went to college to become a CPA. Well, then I learned that becoming an accountant was not neat and it was not numbers. That was bookkeeping. Accounting was all theory and these big, thick books. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not what I want to do. So I graduated with a bachelor's of science and minored in accounting, but didn't want to do it. One of my brothers at the time was opening a restaurant business. And so I thought, well, I need to get a job. And so I went into the restaurant business. So that's how my career started. Okay.
I love that. And so, attorney, right, the epicenter of everything, but starts with accounting and a restaurant business. So what caused that change? So is how long were you in the restaurant business, and kind of what was that change factor?
Yeah, I was in the restaurant business quite a long time. I grew up in it, so it was one of my first jobs. So when I was about 10 years old, my brother opened up a restaurant, and so I went and helped out, and so I kind of learned the business. Wherever I would go, like to college, I'd get a job at a restaurant. I knew how to make pizzas and fling them in the air and those type of things, and we did full menu. So that was kind of the thing to do because I had that skill level. But after a while, the Lord was kind of hitting me saying, so this is great. What are you doing for my kingdom? And I'm like, well, I've got one of those track racks over there. So when people come in the restaurant, they could learn something about prayer, learn something about God. And God's like, no, that's not quite enough. So through some prayer and speaking to people, I've got a brother who's a doctor, who's encouraging me to become a professional. He's like, you're wasting yourself. Go back to school. Go be a professional.
And how old were you at that point?
So I was in my late 20s at that point.
Okay, great.
And I'm thinking to myself, I'm not sure I want to go back to school. I was 29 years old. We talk about Gideon and his 2 fleeces, right? He puts out the fleece and he wants it wet, and then he puts out the fleece and he wants it dry. I put out about 6 fleeces in this whole process, and then all my friends were like, God's going to strike you with like lightning and thunder because you're not listening to the first 4 fleeces. But the point was, if this is what the Lord wanted me to do, I wanted to know this was his will. If I was going to sell my business and sell my house and go to law school at 30 years old and I was just married, if I'm going to completely change my entire life, I want to know that this is God's will. If I'm stepping into his will, I want to make sure it's his will and not my own creation, my own concoction. So that's what kind of led to moving out of the restaurant business, worked for Youth for Christ for a while, met this gentleman named Jay Sekulow, who is with a group called ACLJ, basically got offered a scholarship to go to law school. And I was off and running at almost 30 years old, back in school with my little 3-ring binders and my little tabs like I used to have when I was a kid, back to school again.
So I was reading through and then listening to a podcast of a person last night, and she didn't begin really like her real life until she was 56. Yeah. And we try to talk to our students all the time. People think that Well, once you've gone down this track, that's the track you have to go down.
Right.
And living in the center of God's will is so crucial. Right. I try to tell our students all the time, be in your passion. If you be in your passion, the money will come. Yeah. But don't choose jobs. And we're kind of kids of the 80s, and we heard from a lot of people there. It's just go out and get a job. It's got to make money. That's all it is. Yeah. And I do love the fact of these new millennials. Frankly, they have a better grasp on that than I think probably we did as young guys.
They do. They do. They have passions and they want to follow them in their careers, which is fantastic.
Right.
And kind of this is how I am with my kids too, with my boys. And I say, look, my thought about life is God has given every one of us special skills and talents in special areas. Not everybody's great at everything, but everybody's really good at something. And our goal in life is to tap into that, to figure out what's the skill, what's the passion God has given me, and then use that for his kingdom in your career. Because that's where you're going to be most satisfied. That's where you're going to honor God in what you do, and you're going to be good at it. And it's not like you would just wake up and I'm a great lawyer. You got to work hard, right? Mm-hmm. The work comes along with it. Look at sports. Even the guys who are naturally gifted, the best guys in all sports, they're out there early, they're working late, they're at practice early. And it's the same thing in your career. You've got to work at it to be good, but everybody has that passion. And our job as adults is to make sure that we counsel the kids to find the passion and pursue that for the Lord, because that can be your career. So
let's tap into just a couple of details before we get into some of the cases that I'm kind of geeking over and I can't wait to talk to you about. But here we are at 30 years old. You're married at this point in time. Right. Little kids along for the ride?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Just recently married. We got married when I was 28, so we're only married like a year at this time.
And AJ works with me every day, just a few feet from my desk. Both of your kids are graduates here, and so that's exciting just to see the connections that are just within this one family, which is pretty cool. So at that point in time, tell your new wife that, hey, we're going to cash in the chips and go to law school. Is that a challenge? Is that something that requires conversations and prayer, or is that just, hey, this is where we're rolling?
No, it was a year basically going through the process. When I was at Youth for Christ trying to figure out what to do, praying about it. Law school was on the radar, but I was planning on going to Stetson, which was down in Florida, because that's where both our family lives. We were just married. We didn't want to move away. Then we get this opportunity to go to Virginia Beach from Florida. It's like, okay, we're gonna pick up as newlyweds, leave both our families, and go up north and go to law school on this whole new career. And here I am, 30, and I'm thinking to myself, well, what if I'm not good at this, or what if it doesn't work out? I just move my family up there and then don't have a job when I'm done. And so God just kind of led us through that, through a lot of prayer. We were trying to get out of debt, which is another thing for another day. But don't get yourselves in debt. Who's ever listening to it? It's too much of a weight on you. So we were getting out of debt. So we were putting down these fleeces. Lord, if this is what you want, help me get to law school. Show me where you want to go. And then the scholarship came up, and it was going to be 2 years and not 3. And I thought, well, we really won't want to go into debt again. And so we prayed about that third year, and then went and asked, would you be willing to give us a third year? And they did. So for the first time, they gave us all 3-year scholarships. So the Lord just kind of opened up the doors and said, okay, look, you got to walk through it. So I remember that last conversation after a full year of praying, talking, getting these scholarships, and AJ was behind me, and I had my last phone call about the scholarship. And we said, look, if they offer us that third year, we're going. That's the 6th fleece. If we do more fleeces than that, we got to worry about that. That's right. And we knew once the phone call came that it was okay. The board has approved that third year. You're on full ride scholarship to go to law school, to do this work for the Lord and nothing else. Hung up the phone, turned around, and I said, babe, we're moving to Virginia Beach. And that was kind of the story.
That, and in my own story with my family, living in the center, when you bump into people who are living in the center of God's will, you can see it. Like, you can see it in their demeanor. You can see it because there's a level of satisfaction, and that might be a lawyer for me in school administration. For other people, there's almost any job out there. You can still be living in God's center, but it's rarely easy. And it almost always involves some level of risky behavior.
Sure.
That from a world's perspective, here you are, a successful restaurateur. You're working through this thing. You've got this track. That could have been the easier track, and yet pursuing the center requires the risk of trusting God. And yet here you are, 2 decades later plus, and you've seen the fruition of what it is to live in the center, which is so cool.
Oh yeah, and you know the back end of it is you know God is always faithful.
Yeah.
That's the place you got to start. You got to understand that, and you got to trust that. But sure, it was pretty scary. You know, moving away from both our families. We're just newly married, and we're going up there. AJ didn't have a job. We didn't even have a place to live. We basically shipped our stuff up there and said, okay, in that week's time that it takes for them to get our furniture, we need to find a place to live. We're looking all week, couldn't find anywhere. Our stuff's being shipped on Friday. And we have, so the driver's calling us, where do you want me to bring your furniture? We're like, we don't know. We don't have a place to live yet. And so we're like, Lord, you know, what are we doing here? And so, of course, as God always seems to wait till the last minute, you know, we could talk about that. But, you know, we find a place to live on Friday, and the truck comes the same day, and everything works out. AJ's looking for a job. She meets my boss then, Jay Secular, his wife, and she says, hey, have you found a job yet? And AJ says, no. And she says, well, what do you think about being Jay's assistant? He's opening up an office up here at Regent University. And so God just so AJ got to work with the group I was working with. She got to see what I did, and she got to learn it and be involved in it. So she knew the hours and the stresses, and it was so neat how God just kind of orchestrated all that. So you have that fear of stepping out, but it's kind of like that, you know, the movie where, I was trying to remember which one of the trilogy, but where you got to take a step out. There's a step there, but you don't see it. And then Indiana Jones, right? And then, but until you take the step, then it appears.
Right.
So you got to step out in blind faith. It's kind of like that. You've got to take the step, and God's got you. You take the step, and God's got you. So it's
I also love the component of your story where you have this kind of larger than life figure, this kind of hero in the Christian faith, Jay Seculo, who I think probably most of the listeners will know that name, will understand the shows that he's been running for a long time, and just for how he has cut a very important path for faith in our nation. And so he spots talent in you, and now that talent has really come to fruition where you're impacting the kingdom through what you're doing. In your role, you're supervising 30 to 40 attorneys under you as well. Are you looking for that next round of talent? And what do you do to develop them as talent also?
Yeah, and that is absolutely true. So I learned under Jay, who's a fantastic lawyer, has a mind like a trap. You know, he reads something, he knows exactly what page and who said it and where it was. And of course, we read, you know, hundreds of opinions, thousands of pages. And then about 15, 16 years ago, I moved over to a group called Alliance Defending Freedom, which is where I am now. Fantastic group. I think we're the largest legal organization who defends religious liberty in the world. So it's been such a pleasure taking those things that I've learned and applying them here. And it's just a group that it's not about a particular person, but organizationally, like our CEO Mike Farris, who's a great attorney. He's litigated at the Supreme Court also, but it's about mentoring the next generation. It's about training everyone. It's not one person, you know, necessarily taking that spot. So it's been a neat transition in doing that. And one of the things we're always looking for, and what's odd, I've been here about 15 years, we're always hiring. That's how society, culture is. We're growing. God has blessed us financially. We're a 501c3, so people just donate to us. God has taken care of us for so many years. We've grown, I think, every year since I've been there. And we look for people, you talk about mentoring and how do you move it to the next generation. We look toward people who are hungry for what we do. So we've got this new thing where, you know, we always read some leadership books and things like that. We're Pat Lencioni, and it's called Hungry, Humble, and Smart. And so you're looking for people who, when I interview someone, the first thing I want to know is, are you looking for a job, or did the Lord call you to do this?
That's right.
And that to me is number one, because if I'm weighing jobs and I can get a job here and a job there, you're not quite on the same page. If this is what I want to hear is, look, this is where the Lord called me. This is where my passion is. This is what I want to do. Because you can go make a lot more money in a secular law firm and in big law.
That's right.
And, you know, for as long as I've been doing this, and a lot of us has practiced at the Supreme Court and argued there, you could make boatloads more money. But I was called to this ministry, to this mission, and it's not about the money. Now, God certainly takes care of us, but it's not about the money. It's about going and serving where the Lord called you, and that's the part that you want to tap into, which is what we're looking for in the younger attorneys that are coming
and when
up.
you have that calling, there's no plan B. No plan B will ever answer the what you're searching for,
Yeah.
because that's what God's called you for. So I love that. All right, so the kind of a little bit of background on leadership and a little bit background on your circuitous path that kind of got you to this spot. Let's jump in on some of these cases. So the Supreme Court just ruled in a very important case in the state of Maine. Outline that case for us and how that's going to impact kind of our faith journey as a nation as well.
Yeah. A really big case, and so up north, especially in the Northeast, there's a lot of rural areas, and so a state like Maine doesn't have public schools everywhere in every town. So because their state constitution requires a public education, as most states do, they basically have to figure out how to provide that because they don't have enough public schools there. So what they do is they have tuition assistance where they say, okay, if you live in a town that doesn't have a public school, you can pick the private school of your choice, and then we'll pay a certain tuition rate for you to go there. So regardless of what it happens to be. But they started this requirement or prohibition or restriction a couple of decades ago, where they'll pay for any private school unless you're what they call sectarian, which just means religious. So they won't pay if you decide to go to Hebrew Christian Academy, for example, even though you'll get a state-approved education and you'll get all the learning you need. So that discrimination is what the case was about. Is it constitutional to say we will pay for students to go to any private school of their choice, but we will not pay for them if they decide to go to religious school?
And so in that process, it's the definition of what is an education.
Right.
They've added the idea that it must be non-sectarian.
Right.
And that becomes an interpretation of the law, which again, we see throughout kind of the history of our nation, even since the founders, where they're constantly striving and struggling, and we respect them for it. We want them to, where they're just researching what did the Constitution say and what did they mean, you know? And so here we see this state policy, and now they have sided with these families who were brought this case against the Secretary of Education for the state of Maine. Now they've sided with these families where they will be able to take that money. So what type of implication then does that have? Obviously, for me, I'm in Christian education, but for the countless parents who are paying tuition, and yet they're still paying taxes in their towns, and they will never receive the educational value because their kids are going to be in a private Christian school.
Yeah.
So what do you think the long-term impact of that will be?
I think it's giant for a lot of different reasons. People have heard about the Establishment Clause, the separation of church and state. You hear about it all the time, bantied about. It has been exaggerated, over the past several decades of basically saying that anything to do with government and anything to do with religion has to be completely cut off and separated, especially when it comes to funding or any government programs. So you hear that all the time. You hear that mantra, violates the separation of church and state. You have religion in school. You have some government funding program. These type of cases basically chop that down and say, no, that's not a correct historical view of the Establishment Clause or the Constitution. And so what's interesting about that is the reason that matters so much is that Establishment Clause has been used over the years as a justification, in my opinion, for discriminating against religious people and religious organizations. So if you narrow that construction and say, no, that's not what it means, then you open up, and all we're talking about here is equal treatment. So if you open it up to private religious schools, the law says now you have to open it up to private religious schools. Just because they do a religious thing there doesn't mean you could discriminate against them. And this case was interesting because it followed on a case that I argued several years ago on a similar type issue about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause and where they meet. And what's cool about that there's this area where, and this is another thing. You talk about being geeky, a little bit of historical stuff. The courts and experts always say, well, there's this conflict, there's this tension between the Free Exercise Clause, what rights do we have as individuals to practice our faith, and the Establishment Clause, which is a limitation on government and how much it can get involved in religion. And they say there's always this tension there. Well, that's the problem. There's no tension because I spoke the other day and I said it this way in front of a chaplain's conference out west. And I said, think about that for a minute. So the founders are getting together, right, and they're drafting the First Amendment. And they say we have these two clauses right next to each other, right? We have the Establishment Clause, Congress shall make no law respecting establishment of religion, and the Free Exercise Clause right after it, nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. Well, first of all, it's one clause, it's not two. So the minute you say there's two different clauses, that's already wrong because it's one clause. But then the founders said, you know what? Why don't we put these two clauses in? Why don't we make them conflict with each other? So from now in the future, no one will ever know what they mean, where they land, you don't put two conflicting provisions in the same provision. And so all the point of that is they're both meant for the same purpose. And that is to keep government out of religion, to not prohibit your free exercise and mine, but also to give you and me the biggest robust practice of religion or no religion. That's the other cool thing. The free exercise clause protects people of faith and people who don't have a faith. Because if you don't have true religious freedom, you don't have free speech, you don't have free assembly, you don't have freedom of redress to the government. We call religious freedom, free exercise, the first freedom because all other freedoms are built on that. So my point of that little history lesson is that it's often misinterpreted by the courts and by people and experts to say, well, we should clamp down on religious freedom, it's no good. And these type of opinions say, no, religious freedom is good for everyone, and now everybody gets to benefit from that, whether you're in school or out.
So I want to come back to the case that you were actually the lead attorney on, that even Chief Justice Sotomayor actually named your case specifically in her brief, which was
and just a correction, she's not the chief.
Oh, sorry,
that's okay.
Yeah, right.
But
sorry.
I just didn't.
And
it's nothing to me. But yeah, she's. And what's interesting, we could talk about this too, but the dissents, the few justices who disagree with the majority opinion, they're always good to read. And we'll talk about a couple of things that she said, because they're a lot stronger in their language.
Chief Justice John Roberts.
Right,
yes.
Yeah. Because he wrote the opinion in both the recent Carson case and in the Trinity case.
So I want us to get there because I think it's so, we see how this is led in a linear path of successes. Where we're really debating that. But I want us to hit on this idea of the separation of church and state. I think, frankly, so I wasn't born in this country, so I was born in a different country and grew up in a different country and came here as an American when I was 18. I think because of that, I don't think I take my citizenship lightly, and I frankly think a lot of people do. Yeah. I really value my citizenship. It's something that is really important to me because I see that our nation, as somebody who is truly an immigrant, as an immigrant coming into this nation, man, I appreciate what this nation has stood for. And I appreciate the debate that still takes place with the intentions of the founding fathers. But I think if we were to ask the average American the idea of separation of church and state, I think they would think that that's actually in the Constitution.
Right.
And when we trace that back, right, and please tell me if my history is correct in this, it really comes back to a letter that was written by Thomas Jefferson, where he's the first one to coin that phrase. He coins that phrase as his interpretation of the First Amendment statement. One statement, not two, right?
Absolutely. And it was a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association assuring them that the government won't get involved in their church and their beliefs.
Right.
So completely been spun on its head, but you're right, it's not in the Constitution.
And then that's reinforced with James Madison, where James Madison talks about the wall of separation, right? So he begins to coin this term. So it's the interpretation of some of our founding fathers in this nation, and then it is then taken as truth that it is the separation of church and state, when in essence the intent of the law was so that we would never revisit a Church of England type of situation where you have the king being able to step in and be able to set religious law because he actually wants to establish political law.
Right, and force you to worship a specific faith or beliefs, or punish you if you don't. Not see, that's the other thing too. That's a perfect point. And it's not meant to say the government can't encourage or help with religion or treat it equally among other people. Our history goes back where, our government paid for ministers to go witness to the Indians.
Right.
And so what's interesting is that when you look back at the history, it just doesn't fit, the current mantra. But what's important is that the free exercise clause, again, geeking out, is a personal right that you and I have. The Establishment Clause, the separation of church and state, is argued to be one, but it's not. It's a limit on the government's powers to mess around with your free exercise rights. And if you look at it that way, then they don't conflict and there's no tension. Both of them are there to give people the broadest amount of free exercise protections that you could possibly have. So they work together. They don't work in tension.
Right. And again, we have to look at why it was written. It was written because of the Church of England. Right. I mean, that's why it was written. Now, here's maybe the biggest challenge that I see. So as a Christian in America, and as someone who lives his life in a ministry setting with Christian education, I'm obviously all for this, because could it lead to a voucher structure later on? It's super intriguing to me. It's something I'm following very closely. The state where we live in is Georgia, and Georgia has been pretty cutting edge with a few things that are leading towards the same principle. We have a program here called the Goal program, which is just a fantastic program that allows us to actually allocate on a family level. If you're filing together, you can now allocate up to $5,000 of your Georgia taxes towards the school of your choice.
Yeah, and interestingly, just to throw in there, I worked on a case at the Supreme Court that also helped those tuition programs like the one we have here in Georgia, because there was an establishment clause challenge, right, the separation of church and state, from some taxpayers out in Arizona who said, look, this is government money going to religious organizations, it's unconstitutional. And we stepped in and defended that practice and basically won. And it was a kind of a complicated way to get there, but basically won and was able to uphold those programs. So that's another related case we weren't even talking about, but that's exactly right. You can put your tax money and either pay it to the government, or you can pay it and get a tax credit, which is bottom line, dollar for dollar back. So they're great programs. And you mentioned something before I want to put out there. People need to remember that as taxpayers, we're also paying for the public schools.
Yes.
And we're paying to go to a private school.
Yes.
So people are like, well, you're taking money from it's like, no, I'm already paying for public schools I don't use. And plus I'm paying for, so it's our money in the first place. It's not like the government giving us some stipend out of the goodness of its heart.
So just for our listeners, so they understand. So on a personal level, you can give $2,500. If you're filing with your family, with your spouse, you can give $5,000. If you own an SSO pass-through entity, you can actually give $10,000 for each of those entities, which you won't pay to the state of Georgia in taxes. Now, the argument has been, and it's so intriguing because people have tried to make this only a religious argument.
Right.
But the argument has been, hey, well, they've approved $100 million in the state of Georgia for this program. So now that's $100 million that Georgia loses in tax revenue. Kennesaw State just finished up a very lengthy longitudinal study for the last, I think it's 9.5 years of this program, this SSO program. They've just done, and they've done actually a quantifier on what the financial impact is. And what they've determined is that for every dollar that goes in to this program, the state actually receives $2.13 back. So they've actually done this long-term study where they've actually now been able to prove mathematically, numerically, financially, that the impact on this is actually positive to the state by more than 100%.
Yeah. It saves the state's money. And what's interesting about that, the case I worked on out of Arizona, they call them STOs out there, school tuition organizations, but it was the Arizona Christian School Tuition Organization we represented. And it was interesting because that argument was made, the state's losing money, and it's not true. It shows this program saves the state's money because it saves all the education expenses because, as we all know, the government is not as efficient as private organizations. That's just a fact in the way it is. And so what's interesting is these programs don't cost taxpayer money. They actually save taxpayer money, which is really important for anybody who doesn't go to a private school or says, well, why should I use my money to support what you're doing? Well, the reason is you're saving money too.
What I love is that all the pundits that have responded to this, when it was a religious discussion, they're fit and fiery. But now that it's actually a financial thing and they realize this is actually a windfall for them, it suddenly became pretty smart.
Yeah. And another interesting thing about the case, people always say, well, it's the government giving you their money.
Right.
And this came up at the Supreme Court, and it might have been Justice Kennedy at the time. And he was saying, well, it's not the government's money until you give it to them, or they take it from you, however you look at it, and then it's in their possession. This is your own money that you're not giving to them, you're just giving it somewhere else. And so he made this analogy, like if you went to a restaurant and there was like a $5 off coupon your meal. They're acting in that case like the $5 coupon is actually the restaurant's money, even though you've never given it to them. Your bill just gets reduced by it. And basically he said, just like everything, all money that you make is not the government's until you give it to them. But the other side wants to make the argument that every dollar you make is the government's, and only by grace do they let you keep some. I'm like, wow, that's a pretty frightening theory.
That's terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet that is that overreach that kind of we're constantly kind of trying to hold them accountable for. So anyway, I think the Goal program is interesting. These are all kind of chipping away at the wall. I personally stand on the mindset that I think parents should have the choice. We're in Gwinnett County, and I believe the funding structure last year was $10,863, and I think parents should have the choice on where that money goes, and quite possibly that ends up. In the state of Georgia, we also have had two other laws. One of them is very cutting edge right now. We've had an SB 10 law, which has been a smaller rate of funding for parents who have special needs children. But this last year, they also passed a law called SB 47, which allows a larger quantifier so that the family can actually take their special needs child and make the choice as to what school they're going to send them to. I think that is also going to have far-reaching consequences for those families in Christian ed. Okay, now let me come back to this idea of the law that was just passed, and I want to just take it in a direction that I think people have to understand where that goes. So when the Supreme Court ruled on this with Chief Justice John Roberts, and he put out his statement of, I know there's an official term, it's not statement of finding.
Opinion.
He put out his opinion with that. What's really intriguing is that two of the organizations that expressed joy and contentment over that decision, one was a Muslim organization and one was a Sikh organization, that both talked about how that will impact their education. And this is something that I want to make sure that people understand, is that when we fight for this level of equality, when we're saying a parent has the choice, I think sometimes we think, well, that's only Christian, but we have to understand that that's going to impact everyone. When we say we're meant to have equality, then it's equality, no matter what your background is. How have you seen people respond to that mindset? And do they even understand that in the end, that will be the natural consequence?
Yeah, many of them don't. But I think it's a great point, because when we talk about the freedom of religion in this country, it's freedom to practice any faith or no faith at all. And that's what's the neat thing about the cases that we do. Even if it's on behalf of a Christian school or a Christian church or a Christian organization or a Christian individual, it protects everyone of every faith. And so, for example, if, like you were talking about, if you have a Muslim-based school or a Jewish-based school, they benefit from this too, because the theme of the case is, if the government is going to say, we're going to pay for your children to attend any private school, then you include both secular and religious of any religion. And so the nice part about that equality is it takes care of any religious school, of any denomination or any faith, and it doesn't allow the government to pick and choose which religions, which it shouldn't do. We're going to support one religion and not another. But it puts it across the board and benefits anybody of faith. And we have to keep in mind, anyone who's not of faith that chooses a secular private school, they're getting this benefit too.
Right.
So it's not like they're being left out of the equation.
And really, like, when we look at that mindset, that seems to be such a better application of Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Like that seems like such a better application of that constitutional statement, that it means that everyone's equal. I have this mindset where I think, honestly, the divisions that we experience in America, a lot of that are constituted off of this mindset.
Yeah.
Where we've almost been like trained to be divided because we think that our founders naturally placed in a statement of division. And this wasn't meant to be a statement of division. It was meant to be a non-statement of favor. We weren't meant to favor a Church of England. Yeah. And so here, like, we see this mindset where I actually think the application of this, while it may be disconcerting for some Christian folks who maybe haven't understood that this will be the natural end of this decision, I actually think that it will help support a sense of equality and non-division in our nation, because now everybody's seen. Here's just the truth, like, from a Christian perspective, truth is still truth, right? So if we believe we have truth, then truth still wins in the end.
Yeah, and that statement and what you're just discussing, is loaded, because we can talk all day about that, about division in this country and why. And I think one of the problems is that, this country used to be where everybody had a seat at the table. Everybody got to discuss what they believed and didn't believe, and you'd civilly have a conversation and work towards some goal, some end. The problem now is, and I think, you blame some of it on social media because of the anonymity and those type of things. The problem is that not everybody's views are accepted anymore. If you don't follow the current orthodoxy, which often it's the religious folks who don't, right? We're antiquated, outdated, not progressive, whatever you want to call us. But we don't follow the current culture. And so now people say, well, you don't deserve a seat at the table anymore. You don't deserve to give your views or to make them known or to influence policy or culture. And that's dangerous when anybody accepts that, because the whole point of free exercise and free speech in our country is the best antidote to speech you don't like is more speech.
That's right.
Not censorship, not silencing, not labeling, not these discrimination, hate labels, all this nonsense we have out there. This hate speech. But hate speech now, speech is violence. You hear all these different ridiculous things. And all that means is if I disagree with what you say, not actual violence or threatening violence, but if you say something I disagree with, that's violence to me because it upsets me. Well, that's not how our country was formed. Right. It's not how our country is going to continue to thrive. We've got to be open to points of view that we disagree with, regardless of what they are, and be able to work through those civilly. And civilly is important because we're about to see an opinion come from the Supreme Court about Roe versus Wade, which is a whole different discussion. Right. But a lot of threats being made to justices and people who work in the pro-life movement. This is pure violence. This is not speech, and that's dangerous, and we should never go that route.
So that's a perfect segue, because I want to make sure I jump back into this last piece. There's a quote that is falsely attributed to Edmund Burke, but it's the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Right. And in that quote, we see this mindset where we're almost like trained to be passive. Right. That somehow kindness is passivity, and kindness isn't passivity. Like, I love your statement that the only way to combat hate speech is with more speech. It's not with less, it's with more, that we're meant to debate. So let's trace back to this court case that you were the lead on, that they referenced in this most recent Supreme Court. Outline that case for us just a little bit, the details on that for us, would you?
Yeah, it's one of those cases where the facts come in and you're like, this is great. Like, you couldn't even make up facts that are better than this. And so basically you have the state of Missouri, right? It has this admirable program where it's trying to get rid of all the used tires in lakes and rivers and streams and buried in, because it's not good for the environment. And so they start a recycling program. They say, we're going to take all these recycled used tires and we're going to put them on playgrounds for kids. So they have these new rubber surfaces, so if you fall on the ground, you kind of bounce a little bit. It doesn't hurt as much. It's not like pea gravel or rocks or whatever it happens to be. So they do this program and they say, okay, if you have a school, whether it's public or not-for-profit, you could apply for a reimbursement grant to change your playground surface so when the kids fall, they don't get hurt. Fantastic. And so they have this long application you got to fill out, like the government likes to do, and it's got all types of media components and advertising, and you better make the expenditure first and then you get reimbursed. But they're only going to give out a certain number of grants to a certain number of people, so you can apply. So we have a client who has a preschool there, and the preschool happens to be operated by a church. And so they apply for this grant. So there's like 44 applications. They decide 14 grants are going to be given to these 14 different organizations. Our client is number 5. So they satisfied all the secular criteria that the state wanted and got approved for a grant. No problem. Well, then the state finds out that this preschool is operated by a church, heaven forbid. So they take the grant away. And they say, well, you're a religious organization. We can't give you this money, even though it's just for the surface so the kids don't get hurt. It's like why is it okay to have kids going to a religious school be hurt, but not kids going to a secular school be hurt? It doesn't even make any sense. But they retract the grant and won't give it to them because it's operated by a religious organization. So we file a lawsuit, lose at the district court, lose at the Court of Appeals, go to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court rules 7-2 that violated the Constitution. And what they basically said, Chief Justice Roberts, again, wrote the opinion. He said it's odious to the Constitution, which is a fancy word of saying it stinks, but it's odious to the Constitution to discriminate against religious organizations just because they're religious. So this equal terms kind of thought. If you're going to open this up to all playgrounds, then you got to give it to playgrounds that for religious schools too. Sure. And what was so important about that opinion, it sounds kind of neat and it's kind of narrow facts, but this was the first time in the history of our country where the Supreme Court ruled that not only does it not violate the Establishment Clause to give funds and include religious organizations into the program, right? That's been ruled upon for decades. But it's the first time they ever ruled that the Free Exercise Clause requires the government to allow religious organizations into these programs. That was a sea change. So it was a giant case out of some cool facts, and I got to go visit the school, play with the little kids. It was just one of the neatest things I ever got to do. But arguing that case at the Supreme Court, you don't realize at the time, but how momentous it is, because it established that principle that now led to this new case that basically said, we're taking Trinity and going forward and say, look, we already said you can't discriminate against religious schools, whether it's based on their status of being religious, or whether it's because they're doing religious things, which is what this new case talked about. So a giant ruling, very cool. One of the best experiences of my life, going up to the Supreme Court and argued. That was
and you've argued twice at the Supreme Court.
I have,
and won both times.
I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I've been to the Supreme Court 3 or 4 times. It's just one of those places that is mesmerizing.
Yeah. Awe-inspiring.
It really is. It's there's almost no words for it.
And they build it to be awesome. And what I mean by that is you go into the courtroom and it's not really big.
Not large.
But it's got high ceilings,
right.
And it's got these high curtains. When the case starts, basically everybody has to stand. They knock the gavel. They say the oh yeah, God save the United States in this honorable court. They do the quick little prayer, and then the justices come out from behind the curtains like the Wizard of Oz. It's like I'm surprised they don't do some smoke around it and stuff. But they'll come out and it's just awesome. And so it's just you're at this place, and lawyers. This is for athletes. This is the show.
Right.
This is the ship. This is going to the big game. And so you get there and it's so awe-inspiring. My fear was I'm going to get up there and words won't come out. My throat's going to be locked. You hear stories of people fainting and all kinds of stuff going on. And I'm praying all night long, Lord, give me the words, may it not be me. But it's just such a cool experience to get up there and kind of duke it out a little bit, have these conversations, these debates with the justices who are all brilliant, left, middle, and right. It's just a fun experience. Everyone should go see, at least once in their life just to see how that whole thing works because it's pretty neat.
I've had a chance to go back even into their private quarters, and they've got fireplaces in their offices. I mean, it's awe-inspiring from the minute you get there. So, with your work with Alliance for Defending Freedom, you fly all over the nation, and you're defending cases similar to this. The rubber in a playground. Yeah. That doesn't seem terribly awe-inspiring.
Right.
And it would be so easy for that organization to walk away from it. You were chatting with me a while ago, and you were out in Arizona, and it was like signage for a Christmas fair for a church, right?
Right.
And so that seems, and they told this church they couldn't have signage, but they're letting everyone else have signage.
Right.
And here you are flying to the other side of the country, being away from your family, spending the time. There's money that's being invested in this through this organization that you're with, and it's over signage for a Christmas program. It would be so easy for us to just walk away from that and pay no mind and just say, well, that's just the craziness of our nation, and keep walking. And that's where I want to say is that it is so easy for us as Americans just to walk by things that we know are categorically wrong.
Right.
And just to say, well, that's it. Rather than actually being into the free exchange of ideas with people where we get to challenge them on this.
Right. And decide, is it important enough to take a stand? And so the other neat thing is like, for example, the church we represented in the case you were talking about, small little church in the town of Gilbert, Arizona. Well, how are they going to fight against the state? Right? The state has an unlimited budget. And what do? Well, the neat thing about working with ADF is we don't charge any of our clients. So we'll come in and we'll sue the state. We'll sue the federal government. We'll sue whoever it happens to be. It doesn't matter how big they are. And these cases that go to the Supreme Court, they cost millions of dollars in attorney fees. That's what it costs us to take one of those cases. But we don't charge the clients. We do it for free. But it's the principle that's important there because, number one, how does that individual take the stand without a group like ours? Because you can't afford to. You can't pay a lawyer that much money, over a sign. But these constitutional principles are so important because if we let our rights erode, which for decades the church did, it basically just sat back and said, well, the church shouldn't get into politics, which is not biblical, but again, a conversation for another day. But there's nowhere in life where the Lord ceded any aspect to anyone else, right? So all territory is the Lord's. But what's interesting is when you decide to take a stand on something like a sign to point people toward your church service, or you decide to take a stand on the playground, it's not about that particular thing. It's about whether the government can say, religious speech isn't as important as political speech, or let the kids get hurt over at the religious school because who cares about them? The principles are, should we treat religious people as second-class citizens? Are we allowed under the Constitution to discriminate against them? We hear a lot about discrimination these days, but is that what it's okay? And the answer is no, because these bigger principles are imbued in the sign, are imbued in the playground. And if we're going to let our rights be eroded, and it's going to be our own fault when it comes where we don't have any rights left.
Again, listen, folks who are listening, I say that quote again, often attributed to Edmund Burke: the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I hope that this has been a kind of a challenge for all of us to not remain silent. Passivity is not kindness. We need to make sure that we are standing up for what is right. We need to make sure that we're exercising our voice. Dave Cortman, attorney Dave Cortman, out there chipping away with the sign for Christmas and the rubber in the playground, gets us to the Supreme Court with the idea that could potentially lead to voucher structures in America. It is those small wins that lead us to the big wins. And I hope that for folks who are listening today, we can understand, hey, part of this role, part of our mandate as Americans is to make sure that we're expressing our viewpoints, doing so with respect, doing so with kindness, right, doing so in a nonviolent manner. But equality is equality, and it means equal for everyone. And so, Dave, I thank you for the work that you are doing. I thank you for just being a part of the Alliance for Freedom and for the work that they are doing. This is a worthwhile cause for people to invest in with their tax-free dollars, to be able to step in there and do a donation that's fully tax deductible. It is a great program to have, and it is literally helping shape America. So, Dave, thank you so much for being on the show today. I'm excited for what you're doing, and I'm super excited to see where these cases lead to in the years to come for all of our parents with their tuition dollars as well. Thank you, Dave.
My pleasure. Great to be on.